Cheryl, maybe you can give me a thumbs up that I'm coming through there. All right. It is another Hot Topic Tuesday. It is May 21st, believe it or not. And we are looking further into the settlements with additional clarifications. So, um, we've been through 5 buyer boot camps. We went from spending about 20 minutes talking about the settlement to a couple of hours. And through that, I've learned a few additional points that everybody wants to know about, along with there's always catch up. So let's get right into it because that is the subject matter of the day is what's going on, what are the updates, what additional things have we got for clarifications regarding still the confusion, then we get fear, and fear unchecked leads to panic. And if we what we want to do is kind of remove all of those by getting ourselves educated. So some key points that we need to remember regarding the settlements. And let's keep it simple. KISS principle. Here's the biggies to the changes. There is no advertising of compensation from a listing broker in the MLS. Can't have anything tied to it. We can't post anything in documents. We can't post it with disclosures, anything of that nature. I'll give some additional clarification to that in a few moments here. The other part that we know, and by the way, as I put these down here, I want you to notice they're in quotes. So we must have a signed agreement prior to touring homes while working with a buyer. Now that's what the settlement agreement has in place for us. So if we break into some additional things, then we now know, if you have not heard yet, the effective date, preliminary approval, is August 17th of this year. So I want you to know that the MLS is going to be the one who's going to, we'll call administer, in my quotes, police, to ensure that all of the practices, all of the standards being set forth through the agreements are being followed. Concessions. So a clarification, if we can't advertise, then the concessions may be placed on the MLS. Now, will seller concessions be communicated in the MLS, be binding on the seller? And the answer is no. So if we put it out there that, yes, the seller's willing to pay concessions, the reason it can be done is they're not binding. So like everything else placed into the MLS and how we're advertising or marketing, those are not binding, nor are concessions that may be offered. So that being the situation, they're not binding until it's on the contract, an agreement between the buyer and the seller. So we'll want to keep that simple. It's a purchase agreement. If it's on the purchase agreement, buyer and seller have a fully executed meeting of the minds purchase agreement, then whatever they agreed to would be binding. Now, the only question is will the MLSs that we're involved with actually put it on the MLS? There's things that still need to be considered, legal counsel to be providing guidance to the MLS and so on. Here's what we do know. They may place that a yes or no, concessions, yes or no. They may do that. They may even put the amount of what a seller would offer as concessions. To my understanding, they still, or we still cannot place on the MLS that the concessions would be earmarked for a buyer broker compensation. So the question becomes is whether or not the MLSs, one, will place a concession with a yes or no on it. Two, will they place the amount if? That's going to be entirely up to the MLS. I can tell you with my conversation yesterday with the, what's the word? Anyway, he represents the North Oakland County Board of Realtors membership on the RealComp board. And that is a question that is still to be answered, and they're waiting for more guidance and direction as to what would or could be the implications of having that out there. So from there, again, come on, there we go. Let's move to the written agreement. So it states that there must be a written agreement. So what must this written agreement include? Well, it's got to be specific and conspicuous disclosure of the amount or rate of the compensation that we as a realtor will be determining and agreeing to with the buyer. We need to know that the amount of compensation is a matter that is objectively ascertainable and not open-ended, meaning it's got to be 3%. It's got to be a flat rate would be another option. What it cannot be, as an example, is a range. A term that prohibits the participant from receiving compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the agreement with the buyer. It cannot exceed that amount. So previously and through August 16th, if we signed for 3 and something was offered as 4, or there was a bonus commission on top, we could accept that. We'll no longer be able to do that. And it must include a conspicuous statement that broker fees and commissions are not set by law and that they are fully negotiable. So those are the things that must be in there. And know that as leadership, we are making sure that we stay on top so that August 17th, we are able to be compliant with what comes up. Now, staying with signed agreement, a signed agency agreement. This is not about representation. This is about making sure that the buyer will understand the compensation and there's full transparency. It does not require representation. So it, again, what it says is that we must have a signed agreement prior to touring homes while working with a buyer. What does working with mean? Language is intended to distinguish MLS participants, otherwise realtors, who provide brokerage services to a buyer. Now, this is the important part. This is when you're working with identifying potential properties, arranging for the buyer to tour a property, performing or facilitating negotiations on behalf of the buyer, presenting offers by the buyer or services or other services for the buyer. Now, if you simp at that, those things would mean that we're representing the buyer. Now, note there's a dash there. This is separating that first definition from, catch what the specific verbiage is. It's separate from, we'll put it, realtors who simply market their services or just talk to a buyer, like at an open house, or by providing an unrepresented buyer access to a house they have listed. Now, there's a bit of clarification, and I've tried to communicate with NAR this morning, and I put it out to Brian Western at the state, who is part of our MAR Legal. Then I'm going, well, wait a minute, give me clarification, because there's a key part to this. like at an open house or by providing an unrepresented buyer access to a house they have listed. This doesn't give very much clarity for a company like ours that practices designated agency. So what if Cheryl Henge has a house listed and I hold it open for Cheryl? I don't represent her seller. I don't represent the buyer. So I'm searching for clarification for that situation, for us holding an open house on one which is not our listing, or for a, we'll call it call-in on one of our company listings. As soon as I can get that clarification, I'll let you guys know. But if we are not representing the buyer, it's an unrepresented buyer on our listing, a written agreement with the buyer is not required because we are not working with or for the buyer. As a dual agent, obviously, you're a dual agent, you're working with / for the buyer, and obviously the seller also. Therefore, well, let's face it, guys, we all know if we're working for the buyer, and this is the silly part, we always should have had 2 documents signed, the first one being an agency disclosure, and the second one being a buyer representation contract. Okay? So in the case of we're working with, quote, now for the buyer, then yes, we'll always have those 2 documents. Now, the other part to that is that, let's see, written buyer agreements are required before a buyer tours a home for sale listed on the MLS. So touring a home means when the buyer and or MLS participant or other agent at the direction of the MLS participant, and this is a key, and I think this is where the clarification is at, but I want to know that I know that I know. Let me read that again. Touring a home means when a buyer and or MLS participant or other agent at the direction of the MLS participant working with the buyer enter the house. This includes when the MLS participant or other agent at the direction of the MLS participant working with the buyer enters the home to provide a live virtual tour. So if we're doing a pull up the phone and I got somebody on and I'm going to show them, isn't that neat how that just goes? Anyway, you got it. If I'm doing a tour for them on the phone, well, got to have a signed agreement. So a home, this is another part. A home means a residential property consisting of not less than 1 nor more than 4 residential dwelling units. So what we're talking about is if you've got commercial property or vacant land, it is not required because it states touring a home, with the definition of a home being a residential property consisting of not less than 1 nor more than 4 residential dwelling units. So if you've got a complex, a building that has 5 or more units, that is considered commercial property, and you would not need this. Let me get in some FAQs that came up for me in the past few weeks. So the first one was, if an MLS participant hosts an open house or provides access to a property on behalf of the seller only. Key part of this question. On behalf of the seller only. To an unrepresented buyer, will they be required to enter into a written agreement with those buyers? And the answer is no. But again, here's the key. You're holding your own listing open. We'll get clarification. I'll let you know as soon as I can. I'm surprised that that one's not out there, but excuse me. are written buyer agreements. And again, I want to keep emphasizing it's not an exclusive right to represent. It's not an exclusive buyer representation contract. It's just an agreement that outlines the things that we've talked about. Is an agreement required when a listing agent talks with the buyer on behalf of a seller or only or as subagents? So it's really when you're acting on behalf of a seller. The answer is no. If the MLS participant is working only as an agent or subagent of the seller, then the participant is not working for the buyer. In that scenario, an agreement is not required because the participant is performing work for the seller and not the buyer. Okay? Darlene, I see your question here. Will each office have their own addendum? Well, hang tight because if it's the addendum I think you're asking about, there's just more that we really still need to figure out as we move along. And I'll hit that when it comes to the point of a best practice. So as we keep looking into all of this and we get more and more, and all of those that are above my pay scale keep talking, and that includes all of those representing us at a local, state, and national level, we'll figure out more of what we're going to be doing. But I will tell you that we will have all of the appropriate agreements necessary to be able to live up to what the standards in the agreements have us set for. Here's the next one. If an MLS participant enters into a non-agency relationship with a buyer. So again, why I keep emphasizing the aspect that it's just an agreement, because there could be a non-agent or a non-exclusive relationship. Is a buyer written agreement still necessary? And the answer is yes. Whether it's the agency or non-agency, the obligation triggered once the MLS participant works with that buyer. Well, you got to have something signed. Are written buyer agreements required in a designated agency scenario? When a single broker works both for the seller and for the buyer and designates an agent to represent the buyer. So I've got Lori out there who's under my supervision. She's taken a listing. I've got Lori out there, and Lori's got a buyer who, under my supervision, has an exclusive buyer agency contract. So as a broker or as a brokerage, I, as a supervisory broker, would be in a dual agent position. However, Lori, well, each of my two agents are representing only the individual, one representing the seller, one representing the buyer. So if an MLS participant is working as an agent for a buyer, a written agreement is required because you are representing the buyer. That one's still simple. Okay, so even though it's designated agency, the designated agent representing the buyer must have an agreement of some sort. Okay. I keep checking to see if there's any other questions that pop up through this. So here's one of the things I want you to know. Save the link. Now, guys, I don't have it. And well, let me see if I can actually pull that off here real quick. No, I can't. Not with the way I got it set up. But go look for the NAR frequently asked questions. Matter of fact, I think if you type it up, it's going to come up. Save it to your computer. Look for the changes because it's getting updated constantly. Okay. What we need to do is to make sure that we're educating the public, that we stay calm and confident. And as you've heard me say, have your verbal judo. You know them as scripts. and we're all going to have them, and we all got to create our own, and we've got to make sure that we're using the proper language as we do this. So you need to know your stuff. You need to anticipate what the public's common questions are going to be and rehearse what your responses are. If we really understand the settlement, then your responses become easy. There you go. Steve, thank you. So check the chat there, guys. And Steve has done me a huge favor and all of us a huge favor by putting in there the link to the NAR frequently asked questions. Save that in your bookmarks so that you've got it. Let's talk best practices, because this is something that has come up recently. Are we going to be farther ahead offering seller concessions and making it part of the purchase agreement? Or would we be farther ahead by offering broker compensation and having a separate agreement between the broker who has the listing and the buyer's broker? There are many that are saying, look, it's 3% either way. And I think that's the key that we want to know. So when it comes to our marketing strategy, thinking with that question, if a seller is offering 3% concession for the buyer's broker, although we can't earmark that, if it's advertised, will we be farther ahead having the buyer add it to the purchase agreement as a seller concession? Or would it be farther ahead having a broker compensation? As of this day, May 21st, 2024, there's not an answer to that one, but it's food for thought. Here's another best practice. Have patience. I was just speaking yesterday again with the MAR, well, let me rephrase that, the North Oakland County Board representative to Realcomm, and with the NOCBOR president. Both of them emphasize patience because the board, and I'm going to assume most boards, and Realcomm are exercising patience. They'll be ready, but they're saying be patient. We're constantly getting clarifications to all the things that we need to do, and that includes paperwork. And that's where we're asking for patience with even MAR, because that's really where most of our direction and guidance is going to come from, with clarifications as they continue. So how do we go about getting people to sign an agreement? Treat it, let me tell you what I put on the screen here. Do what you do with a seller. Before you start promoting and marketing, advertising, doing all these things for a seller, you start out with a simple appointment, and it's for a job interview. So you're going to really work on converting inquiries into job interviews, these consultations with the buyer, because why would anybody sign anything until they like you, trust you, respect you? And how do we get somebody to like us, trust us, respect us? We've got to bring out our value. And once they see the value, it's at that point where we could anticipate that they would be willing to sign an exclusive buyer agency agreement and be more than happy to be committed to have to pay you. So a couple of words that I want you to write down as a best practice. One is transparency. That needs to be part of your verbal judo. All of what's come out of this is about the transparency in working with buyers and sellers as to how our compensation works. So that would be another one I want you to write down. Compensation. Compensation. It's already part of our agreements. It is compensation. I'd like you to eliminate commission from our discussions with buyers and sellers. The only entity that pays our commission is our broker. Now, another term that you could use with a seller is a marketing fee. Marketing fee. So either compensation or a marketing fee. Those are some key terms to use in your verbal judo as you work to get an exclusive buyer agency agreement signed. And then, guys, I challenge you to do this. We've probably, I'm going to say, had about 70 people go through our buyer boot camp. I anticipate that we're going to do more of those because when asked, what is your value? And this was pretty consistent between each of the locations. I would put 4 or 5 individuals together and say, tell me your individual and what you're going to do to help me find a home. And it was not uncommon to have a list of about 5 things, give or take, from those 4 or 5 people. And if that's all we come up with, guys, this is your coach loving upon you. We don't know our value. And if we don't know our value, we can't explain it to a buyer. And if we can't explain it to a buyer, why would they ever want to commit to signing a contract to buy a home from you? We've got to get that. Like, trust, respect. Once they got that, you can ask them to sign a contract. We've earned the right. So let me ask you, are there any other questions out there? I see one from Holly. If we put an offer in, do we have to include our buyer's contract in the future? No. I think that's still going to remain consistent, Holly, with the aspect of why are we not asking for the agency agreement or their contract, but we simply want to know their agency disclosure. The reason for that is simply that we only offer compensation to a buyer's broker, buyer's agent, or a transaction coordinator, or for some reason, none of the above pops up. Okay. We don't want sub-agencies. So the only reason that we're asking for their agency disclosure, we've never asked for their contract, is for that reason. Okay. So not necessary to get the contract. That's up to the MLS to figure out how they're going to use that to be able to enforce. And by the way, typically that means it's us. So here's what we know. We're not going to put ourselves or our customer or our company at risk by not living up to the standards in the agreement. We're always going to get that agreement, but we are going to be continue to be self-policed, and I don't want to drop out of being a protected member of that class so that I don't get sued in the future, nor does the company want to be in that position. So we're going to perform up to the terms of the agreement. Any other questions? You can put it in the chat or take yourself off of mute. We'll answer what we can. And what are we at? A minute or two? Yep. Anything? Well, guys, this will be placed up onto the HRC Agent Development channel. Know that next week we will not have a Hot Topic Tuesday. That's following Memorial Day. There are a number of exciting things coming up. Make sure that you sign up to be a part of the new Back at You social bay. Make sure you're a part of that. We have those set for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week. And gosh, I'll tell you what, we've got a lot coming. Following that, basically all of June's Tuesdays are going to be Back at You Media with Jay Bellinger, our tech trainer. We've got coming up in July special programs with Mark Will from Dale Carnegie Institute. He's the owner, primary speaker. Dale's going to be with us on our deep dive in July. And then we're going to follow it up with a live presentation by him to where you can build upon the skills and a couple other techniques he's going to provide on. Matter of fact, you can make a note of it. Tuesday, July 23rd. It will be from 10 to noon in Rochester. So lots coming up, lots of education directly from here within the HRC companies, Century 21 and Coldwell Banker, all the way around, guys. Lots of stuff. Biggest thing we can do, go out there, see a whole lot of people, get listings. Have a great one, guys. See you in 2 weeks.